Welcome to Asian Times TV at Princeton TV. That's the name of the show. We're welcome to have with us today Christine Fair, who's an expert in South Asia, languages, culture, and civilization. And she also has an expertise in South Asian geopolitics, terrorism, counterterrorism, and the whole debate that we've been having in the U.S. With our involvement in South Asia and Afghanistan, Pakistan. So we're going to talk about all these issues today. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Fair, who's at Georgetown University. She's a professor in the Department of Strategic Studies. At
Peace and Security Studies.
Peace and Security Studies.
Yes.
Fantastic. So we'll welcome her to Asian Times TV. It's a new show we've just started at Princeton TV, looking at this whole pivot towards the Asia-Pacific region that the State Department announced. Hillary Clinton announced it as well, and she wrote a paper on it in Foreign Policy in November, I think it was, last year, that she said that the future of politics will be decided in Asia, not Afghanistan or Iraq, and the United States will be right at the center of the action, according to her. So what do you think of this idea, given you've studied the area, South Asia broadly, Punjab, Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan as well. What do you think of this pivot that the U.S. Department is making, State Department is making?
Well, the pivot's been in the making for quite a while, right? So,
okay.
She herself went to India for the first time in 1984, and it was actually her as First Lady that gave her husband, then President Bill Clinton, the idea that India was going to be a new partner of considerable consequence for the United States. And then we know that as early as 1997, the Clinton White House was trying to engage India in what was then called the Strategic Dialogue. I know this because when I was a baby analyst, I was an intern in the Mumbai consulate.
This is at RAND? You were an analyst?
Yeah. Well, no, when I was just beginning my career, in fact, I was still in graduate school. I did a summer internship in the consulate in Mumbai.
I see.
And everyone was ratcheting up what was called then the Strategic Dialogue.
I see.
And what was meant in those days by Strategic Dialogue was that essentially the Americans were sending a bunch of secretary level visits, and this was then going to culminate in a presidential visit in May of 1998. And of course, we know that didn't happen because India tested. So the U.S. effort to pivot towards India has actually been ongoing for quite some time. One of the biggest impediments was obviously Clinton's commitment to nonproliferation.
Right.
So the Indians saw an opportunity when George Bush was elected, because of course the first thing he did was got out of the
So in '98, when India tested, were you in Mumbai at the time?
No, I was in Mumbai that summer. And so I was like everyone else. We were all wrapped up in trying to pave the way for this strategic dialogue
right.
that would then open up the way for this presidential visit.
Yes.
That was literally blown out of the water, literally. Right. So it took a while to get that back, to get that going again. What eventually happened was that Stroh Talbot basically led a high-level series of discussions about India's strategic needs, and this kind of paved the way for what essentially became the George Bush policy towards India, the Civ nuke deal, and so forth.
Right.
So,
Stroh Talbot, of course, the head of Brookings, right?
Well, that's where he is now.
Yeah.
So in some sense, this movement towards India is not new. I mean, it's been a very slow process. And Ashley Tellis, who was my boss and mentor at the RAND Corporation, in 2000 really authored the document that laid out what the Bush White House policy towards India would look like. And he was the author of this policy known as dehyphenization, which is the U.S. will engage India and also Pakistan on the merits of that bilateral relationship, without regard to the security competition between them. Because it used to be if the president went to India, there would also be a need to go to Pakistan, and this would also be true for any other U.S. official. If we gave a certain kind of assistance to India, it would be with thought to the consequences for the U.S. relationship with Pakistan. So this decoupling was really the child, if you will, of Ashley Tellis. And implementing this, of course, came into a big roadblock called 9/11, because he had argued for a soft landing for Pakistan. And of course, a soft landing for Pakistan wasn't possible because we needed Pakistan to prosecute Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan.
Right.
So this has been a pivot that's been very slow, but steadily coming.
I see. Wait. So spend just a little bit of time there. So broaden it out though, because you've been focused really primarily on India, and then a little bit Pakistan. So how does it open up to the Asia Pacific? Is it because of the rising threat of China?
Well, that was the logic, right, of the reach out to India, particularly under the Bush administration, was that China's rising. It's uncertain how it's going to rise, but we know the consequences of China's rise will be enormous, be it economically, be it politically. Mm-hmm. China and India are going to be huge players when it comes to global commons like sea lanes of control, whether we're talking about global warming, emissions.
Yes.
So China and India are going to be important players. Obviously, we've seen India and China behaving in interesting ways at the WTO.
Right.
So there was this sense, particularly, it was very acute in the Bush White House in the Bush years, that India and the United States have a lot in common in terms of our apprehension about China's rise and what it means, and this desire to jointly try to manage India's rise. So basically managing China's rise became a euphemism. But if you look at the writings of Ashley Tellis, if you look at much of the argumentation in support of the Indo-US nuclear deal, it was really about trying to, containment's not the right word, because you can't use India to contain China.
Right.
But it was really about, by emboldening the Indians to do what the Indians want to naturally do, which is to be competitors. India wants to have a blue water navy. Indians like to say they call it the Indian Ocean for a reason. They want to be economically competing over hydrocarbons, over even things like weapons markets, manufacturing, helping other countries update and reconfigure old weapons platforms. The Indians want to be a player in all of this stuff.
So how has that been working out though? Because India has not necessarily, caught up with China or, by any stretch of the imagination, even sort of be trailing China. I mean, India is far behind. You look at the WTO numbers, or manufacturing.
But the intention was not to have India go head to head with China.
Right.
The intention was and remains to have another competitor swimming in the varied waters in which China also swims. So you'll see India and China competing, for example, for liquefied natural gas contracts or access to oil. So the idea was not that by propping up India is going to be on its own able to hold China back. That wasn't the logic at all. The logic was simply to temper China's rise by enabling India to do that which it already wanted to do.
Okay.
But to get to your point, there's been a lot of disappointments, in terms of, the Americans put a lot of capital on the table in terms of reconfiguring decades of non-proliferation legislation and anti-proliferation legislation, which those legal frameworks were in fact spurred on by India's first test in 1974.
Right, but the nuclear deal is still being implemented, right? I mean, it's not actually.
Yeah, but my point's a little bit different. So on the U.S. end, we've done just about everything that we needed to do, and we went to the NSG, we went to the Zanger Committee, we went to the IAEA. We spent a lot of political capital getting India basically recognized as a new form of a de jure nuclear weapons state.
Okay.
There was an implicit expectation that India would reciprocate, and there were a couple of issues that were argued to have been an implied quid pro quo. The first is that this was going to open up the Indian market to American nuclear suppliers. Now, this is money goes where money safe, right? After Bhopal, no American firm is just going to, go invest in nuclear infrastructure in India.
But that has happened to some extent, right? Because all of the players.
No.
No.
No, it hasn't happened at all, because basically the Lok Sabha has been promising to pass a limited liability bill that would provide American firms coverage. Now, I'm sure there will be Ukrainian firms There will be firms that have national backing, like nationalized firms that
Right.
don't have the same exposure to liability
Right.
that private sector American firms do. That hasn't happened.
So when the Obama administration in '09 went there and cut a deal for, I don't know, some $10 billion worth of business, it didn't contain any nuclear corporations, is that right, or players?
I mean, I can't say none because
Okay.
it depends on what you might want to cram into that shoebox. But in
Right.
terms of providers of, nuclear turbines, nuclear material, nuclear plants, which was actually promised, I mean, this was basically discussed.
Right.
When we change this legislation, India's going to open up its market to an industry here, which has been, a shambolic industry for quite some time.
Right.
And that never happened. The other thing that India did not follow through on, that there was extreme exceptions, there were extreme expectations here, and quite frankly, vexation when it didn't happen, was that there was this implicit suggestion that the Indians would purchase American weapon systems. And the big item that was being dangled in front of the noses of American legislators was the medium-range multi-role combat aircraft. There was virtual promises made that the Indians were going to buy an American platform to fill that need for what the Indians called the MMRCA. And in fact, the Indians kicked out the Americans in the first round. It's impossible to overstate how pissed off people were
Right.
In Congress.
Yeah, I do
and in
remember that
DOT
story,
when that
yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
What?
I do remember that story.
Yeah, it
So-
was pretty outrageous.
So shifting to Pakistan now, because we're going to talk about that in terms of the current situation in Pakistan, of course. So clearly, I mean, I think you've painted a very good picture, which is that America trying to juggle lots of interests in South Asia, trying to balance off China, props up India, and then 9/11 happens, right? And that kind of changes the whole narrative significantly for a decade, right? Because it puts Pakistan obviously in a very
No, during this entire entire decade, the Americans were, as well as the Indians, were making enormous strides in a
Okay.
relationship that had really been mired in a number of structural conditions for a very long time. Even while the Americans were pursuing a very aggressive agenda with India, including promising to make India or to help India become a global world power, or a global power inclusive of military assistance, obviously the Indo-US nuclear deal.
Right.
At the very same time, the Americans were also doing relatively unprecedented things with Pakistan. The problem, of course, is that what the Americans didn't understand is how the US engagement with India would seriously play out in terms of Pakistan's long-term thinking about Afghanistan. Because these policies towards India and Pakistan were pursued in relative isolation of each other, in these sort of vertically integrated silos. And it's supposed to happen at the NSC level when people realize how these policies affect each other horizontally. But while the Americans were doing all of this stuff in India, and while the Pakistanis were relatively quiescent about it, what was actually happening was that the Pakistanis were deeply furious. And they concluded that how is it that the United States can say that India is its most important strategic ally while it's completely dependent upon Pakistan to fight this war in Afghanistan? And the Pakistanis began probably as early as 2004, if not earlier, beginning to undermine the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. But the Americans, regrettably, just they were not on the clue bus.
Right. Okay. So now then going into Pakistan, the situation now, of course, is mired, very turbulent, and of course, I've heard you say that Pakistan is slowly moving towards a coup. Given
Well, that's been halted. When Imran Khan made it very clear that he wasn't going to play, and probably because Imran Khan doesn't understand politics, their alternative was taken away from them. So when it became clear that Imran Khan wasn't going to be a viable plan B, they had no choice but to sort of step back. And that's why, for example, Hussein Haqqani was eventually let go. There was just no point continuing to try to push this government to collapse because they hate Nawaz, the army hates Nawaz Sharif as much as they hate Zardari. And without Imran Khan that could be built up in a weak coalition, there's no plan B for them. So I don't see what seemed very possible in December and January doesn't seem very likely now. There's no incentive now for them to bring down the government because you're essentially entering into an election season anyway, right? There'll be elections within a year.
So what happens to this whole memo gate and I think there's an American businessman, right, who's also involved?
Oh my goodness, yes. Oh, he's total scoundrel.
Okay.
Essentially, that does not go away. And in Pakistan, dramas of this sort, they're always kept in the icebox, right? These charges will never go away. They will be used to hunt and to haunt and to hound Hussein Haqqani for as long as he has any aspiration of a political career. So this will be left hanging on the hook that they can take down and use to restrict Hussein Haqqani whenever it's convenient. It's for the same reason, the various charges that have been pending against Zardari, the NRO, the National Reconciliation Order, absolved him of those charges, but then the Supreme Court went back and reinstated them.
Right. So the Prime Minister now, of course, has been found in contempt of court, right?
Yes.
Mr. Gilani.
That's Gilani. So they're separate issues. So
Right.
the problem with Zardari was that he had all of these charges that were absolved through the National Reconciliation Order with President Musharraf. Supreme Court reinstated them in 2009, but the government, now with the 18th Amendment, is now officially under Gilani. Pakistan's been restored to a parliamentary system where the powers largely reside with the Prime Minister. They didn't do anything to reinstate those criminal charges against Zardari and other members of the PPP whose charges were also absolved by the NRO. So that's how Gilani, there are no charges of corruption that were pending against Gilani. Where Gilani has fallen afoul is that he did not do anything to reinstate the criminal charges pending against his co-party members.
Right. Okay. And that's it. That impasse still continues, right?
That will continue. That's not because now the goal here, though, is to keep this going out long enough that the PPP. I still think the Army, all else equal, would prefer the PPP to the PMLN, but obviously they would have preferred Imran Khan to play ball and to get a clue and understand how Pakistani politics works. He can't win on his own. He can only win in coalition.
Right.
And he's written off, coalition building. So he's a non-starter now. So the Army, again, is really without a plan B.
But still, Pakistan is sort of left hanging in the balance now, right? As you've described the situation, as U.S. leaves the Afghan theater, or plans to leave the Afghan theater by 2014, and is withdrawing troops already, substantially. And of course, Afghanistan is not allowing supply routes to open.
You mean Pakistan?
I mean, Pakistan is not allowing supply routes to open.
That's people don't understand this. This is a political fig leaf.
Okay.
What is not happening, and has not been happening since November 24th, there are no goods moving through Pakistan's what's called the G-lock, the ground lines of control. This is obviously the most cost-effective way of moving things, subject to there being pilferage and, every once in a while, trucks get blown up. So what they've done, and no one pays attention to this because no one knows, is that we're not moving stuff through the ground locks, the G locks. We're actually now moving them through what's called the air locks, the air lines of control. So all of those products that used to get offloaded at Karachi, stuck on a jingle truck, and taken to Afghanistan either through Baluchistan or through the Khyber Pass are now being flown. What means is that the war is still being supplied, but the Americans are paying a lot more money for it.
Right.
So it's not as if supplies have stopped.
Okay.
And the Pakistanis are in fact quite surprised that the Americans haven't caved on this. They're absolutely shocked that the Americans have been willing to let the G-lock stay closed for this long. But the fact is everything's being supplied through the air.
But talk about Pakistan overall, though. I mean, in terms of where now it sits geopolitically and strategically with the U.S., leaving Afghanistan, having a close relationship with India.
Yeah, but we're not really leaving. See, this is another misnomer. The U.S. isn't leaving Afghanistan. This
Well,
is not like Vietnam.
Right.
Last helicopter leave the embassy, and everyone's trying to climb on board.
Well, not entirely, right? Because there'll be a contingency force there. We don't know how many.
Well, actually, no, it's very unknown
Yeah.
what 2014 is going to look like.
Okay.
The desire is that the Americans will not be doing counterinsurgency operations, right? That's the desired end state. But what's very likely to happen, provided that money continues to flow, is that we will be shifting to a training mission, right? Because the ANSF still suck. I mean, they're still abysmal. And we're also going to be very likely to, and all of this depends upon what kind of strategic agreement akin to a status of forces agreement that the Americans negotiate with the Afghans. That will dictate under what conditions we're there. Some of the sticking points will be under whose jurisdiction do contractors and military personnel fall. I mean, Americans have been very loath to have their citizens subjected to indigenous courts when the indigenous courts are like Afghanistan or Iraq, right?
And that's being negotiated now, will be in May, right, in Chicago. A lot of these things will be.
Well, this always happens. Like they'll say it's going to be negotiated in some traveling roadshow venue, but it's just not that complicated. It's not that straightforward. It's a lot more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of moving parts. So what it means to leave Afghanistan, I think, has been largely misunderstood. Okay. I wish that we would leave, as in really leave, but that I don't think that's going to happen for a number of reasons, mm-hmm. and especially as the operating environment for drones, for example, in Pakistan become more difficult. The Americans read that as CIA is going to be looking for alternative bases from which they can conduct these drone strikes into Pakistan.
And where are they going to find those, you think?
Afghanistan.
Okay.
For example.
Right.
I mean, we're still running. The Americans got run out of one base. They got run out of Shamsi, but drones are still flying, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yes. There actually were two bases where drones were based. One was Shamsi, one was Jacobabad.
Okay, got it. All right. So they're not. I mean, Americans are not leaving entirely. This is another thing, of course, that is yet to be determined in terms of what the structure of the force will be. That'll be left behind. But still, lots of moving parts.
Yeah.
So talk about what happens in Pakistan. I mean, as a state that everybody's saying is either failing or has failed.
Well, I mean, I get so exhausted with that because what people don't understand is that when independence took place and the subcontinent was cleaved into India and Pakistan was really gypped out of virtually everything. It had no fully functioning ministry. There had never been a history of governing Pakistan from Karachi. Obviously, India retained all of the major administrative and military infrastructure. I could go on at length. I mean, Pakistan was sort of like that little symbiotic twin that just got cleaved off and left to fend for itself. So, you can ask the question.
That's clearly one narrative, right?
It's not a narrative. It's actually fact. It is actually fact. So if you look at for example, the defense production infrastructure, where was that? It was in India, right? Whether you were looking at ordnance, whether you were looking at officer training institutions, it's not a narrative. It's just a fact. The Indians were supposed to transfer what was called Pakistan's share of movable goods, but then the 47-48 war began, and India is not going to send military equipment to what had now become a military adversary in a hot war. Mm-hmm. Similarly, the Indians did not transfer to Pakistan's share of the treasury. And so the Pakistanis actually had to go and scrap together a bunch of money from the Brits. And the Brits had their own motivation for doing that. But remember, after 1947, the Brits themselves were also poor after the war. So it wasn't as if there was a lot of largesse to go on. So it's not a narrative. It's just a fact that none of these ministries were functional. remember, you have to also recall that if you look at the history of the subcontinent, what became West Pakistan and now Pakistan had not been fully bureaucratized, right? So the British history was was occupation through either the sort of mercantilism or later through militarism after the mutiny. And then you had the bureaucratization, and then the final phase of that was indigenization, where they began inducting Indian cadres. And by Indian, I'm talking about the subcontinent, not India.
So is that one of the reasons you believe that Pakistan has had, a military sort of
Well, there are
state?
multiple there's multiple reasons for that, but the first is that of all the institutions that Pakistan inherited, it was the strongest. Now, I will say this much: it also did not inherit a single unit in full strength, because after the mutiny, the Brits did not want an all-Muslim unit. So this is just math. You divide up the army and there are no full Muslim units. It does mean that Pakistan did not get a single full strength unit. It had an officer shortage that was much more acute than that which India experienced.
So the claim is made that now, for the first time, the judiciary is strong enough and civic institutions are strong enough in Pakistan in 65 years of its history that there is some attempt to reach a balance where the power of the military may be, checked by either the judiciary or the government. Is that
It's not
your
a question
understanding?
of checking. The problem with Pakistan's judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, is it's now overreaching its powers. The Supreme Court has become exceedingly activist. On the one hand, while it trashed the doctrine of necessity, which justified previous military takeovers, the court, ironically, is issuing its own doctrine of necessity in the sense that whatever it thinks it should be able to meddle in, it does. And a really good example of that was Memogate. So the problem with Pakistan's judiciary is that it's very erratic. It is becoming involved in issues that judiciaries are not typically supposed to be involved in. And so the courts become very political in a very unpredictable way. In some cases, like the National Reconciliation Order issue and Memogate, it's acted in a way which has been very helpful to the Army and to the ISI. On other issues, for example, being very interventionist on the missing persons, like in Baluchistan. In addition, the conditions and terms under which state assets have been privatized. These are things that have been very injurious to the Army's interests. And then don't forget, you have these very deep political alliances and allegiances between this Chief Justice Chaudhry and Nawaz Sharif, because it was Nawaz Sharif that really, his political movement joined forces with the lawyers' movement to put pressure on the Army to finally require, in some ways, Zardari to make a concession on the Supreme Court justice. So it's not that this institution is becoming competent and capable of reigning in the Army. What it is that the Supreme Court itself is becoming an extrajudicial, ironically enough, body of power that is acting unilaterally because it thinks it can and because it thinks it should. And I'm not sure that's a good thing either.
So, but basically, Pakistan still kind of muddles along. Then is that?
Yeah, I mean, it just muddles along. I don't see things. Well, it could be worse, than muddling along.
I'm sorry?
It could be worse. It could be worse than muddling along. It could be Somalia, but it won't be Somalia.
Right.
But I think.
Well, slightly ahead of that, right? Because that was a complaint that. When it was labeled a failed state, it was clumped together with these sub-Saharan African countries who are, really.
Well, see, the failed state discourse is, I find, very frustrating in a more general sense, but it doesn't understand the history of Pakistan. Every single bureaucracy that Pakistan inherited was anemic, skeletal. You'll read accounts of some of the very first bureaucrats. They didn't have pens and papers, and they were literally writing on mango crates. I mean, it's impossible to explain in a way that people would understand the challenges of the Pakistani state. Also, remember that relative to India, the burden of resettling refugees was much, much harder on Pakistan because it was a larger percentage of the population. In addition, because Pakistan was the succeeding state, not the successor state, Pakistan also, within a very small amount of time, had to create its own currency. But people forget about what does it mean to set up your own currency. And of course, currency, it's not an issue of printing it, right? Currency, to have currency means it has to have a value, which means that it has to be established in a market.
Right.
So if you think about everything that Pakistan had to do, and of course India was not remotely interested in honoring any of the partition commitments because Pakistan essentially started a war with India, right?
So in the remaining minute that we have,
Yeah.
we've spent half an hour already talking about these issues. Fascinating, of course. I could go on forever. I'm sure you could as well. So what is the prognosis that you're leaving us with, for the region, broadly speaking? Of course, India is continuing to do well, relatively speaking. Afghanistan will have some sort of an American presence. And then the relationship with U.S. and Pakistan is taking a breather, it seems, right now because the focus is on Iran. But what do you see happening in U.S.-Pakistani relations then in the near future?
U.S.-Pakistan relations, we're in a breather, not because of Iran. We're in a breather because after the Salhalla bombing and after bin Laden and a bunch of other things, Pakistan, and I think it's good for Pakistan, it's running a parliamentary commission that's looking at what will be the terms of U.S.-Pakistan engagement, at what price, at what cost, and in what issue areas.
Fantastic.
And Pakistan's going through an election cycle, just like the Americans are.
Right.
And on the American side, Congress is still trying to get its feet after, many people don't know what to make of the May 2 bin Laden adventure. And of course, we are in an election cycle. So nothing is going to happen of any consequence on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship until we've gone through our respective election cycles.
Got it. Excellent. So at that interesting, cross path, I guess, or fork in the road, we thank you for joining us today, and we thank our audiences for listening in, tuning into this interesting discussion on South Asia, U.S.-India relationship and U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and the continuing presence in Afghanistan that U.S. will be maintaining. So we thank you, Dr. Fair. I hope you'll join us again, and we'll go into it more depth, hopefully.
Anytime. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Appreciate it.